He's held a number of debates with atheists, secular, agnostics, liberals, and all sorts, and his work involves explaining and demonstrating the rational argument, the Islamic position. So, without further ado, inshallah, we'll invite our esteemed brother Abdullah to the stage. Thank you very much, guys.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. As-salatu was-salam Nabi Kareem Muhammad wa alihi tayyibin wa sahbihi salihin. I greet you all with the Islamic greetings of peace. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. May the peace and blessings of God be upon you all. I'd like to thank the Leicester Islamic Society for inviting me, Leicester University for also extending the invitation, and the Student Union. Kind of to get right into it, the topic today is, do humans need God? And I found a very fascinating title because it assumes, or rather not assumes, but it includes this term need. And before we discuss whether we need God, whether any human beings need God, whether mankind needs God, we first have to ask, what is need and what do humans need? And need is generally defined in most dictionaries as something that is required because it's necessary or essential or is simply very important. And of course, need depends on what your goals and aims are. If humans need meaning to their lives, then that can only come from intention and purpose. What I mean by that is, you see these texts on the screen here, so send anonymous questions to this number. It's because you know what the signifiers are, and these signifiers have an intended meaning, which is what gives the meaning in the first place, and you learned the intended meaning of each of these individual signifiers, which we call words. And of course, when they are all compiled together in that arrangement, they produce some intended meaning that conveys information. So basically, if human life has no intention behind it, if the universe has no intention behind it, it has no purpose, no direction, no reason for it to have existed, other than it just exists, then there is no meaning to human lives. Meaning can only come if the universe, and thereby humans, have an intention behind their existence. And that only comes if the universe was intended to come into existence, was created intentionally. And that can only happen through what we call, to use the concept or the word, God. If you don't believe in a God, then you don't believe in any intention behind the universe, because God creating the universe would thereby impart intention. Of course, humans need an intellectual justification for morality. If that's what you believe, then where do we acquire this? Because this can only come from a criteria. If you say that humans must have a morality, and morality basically means good or bad. I often ask the question, what do you mean by good? And what do you mean by bad? How do you define good and how do you define bad? It's like asking, how do you define blue and how do you define green or red or orange? If you don't see these things, if you don't sense these things, then you couldn't define them. But with morality, there's a bigger question. So how do you define good or bad? If you define good or bad based on what you enjoy and what you don't enjoy, well, this is very subjective. This is very arbitrary, because we all differ as to what we think is good or bad. But ultimately, in the universe, is there actually good and bad? Can you find good and bad under the microscope or behind a telescope? You can't. What wavelength does good and bad follow on the electromagnetic spectrum? You can't find it. However, good and bad can only come from human purpose, because what's the difference between a good car and a bad car? Can anyone tell me? Good car, bad car. What's the difference? What makes a good car?
Badge.
Sorry?
Badge.
The badge. Clearly into designer labels there. What about more practical definitions of what's a good car? It works. What do we mean by works? It takes you places. Okay, so a good car is a car that takes you places. What about a bad car? Sorry? A slow car. Okay. Anything else?
maybe like level of luxury. So a good car will be classed as one that's like, you know, has suspension, you know, you don't feel the bumps kind of thing. But a bad car is one where you can feel everything.
Okay, but fundamentally, what makes a bad car?
Something that doesn't run.
Doesn't run. So fundamentally, a bad car is a car that doesn't run. You know, you could be given the best car with the best suspension, thick rims, the best label and badge. Open up the bonnet, no engine. That's a bad car. I don't care what label you have on it. So good and bad can only be defined according to purpose, because a car is defined as good and bad by whether it fulfills its purpose or not. So a car that was built to traverse distances and transport humans a distance is a good car because that's what we made it for. That's its intent. A bad car is a car that fails to fulfill that purpose. So this is a good and bad car. But if humans have no purpose, well, then there is no good and bad for humans. The only morality, if you want to deny purpose in the universe, the only morality in the universe is the possible and the impossible. That's the only morality the universe has if you deny purpose. So the only way that could be provided is if there is a purpose behind the universe, purpose behind us, and then a criteria of how we measure up to that purpose. That is an intellectually justified moral system. And what about a moral system that's consistent? So, let's forget justifying morality from a cosmological perspective. What about morality that is just consistent, that you apply it and it always works, and there's always a motivation for human beings to follow it? Well, here's a problem. Because if you give if you give a system of morality to any human being, what would make them want to follow it? There has to be a motivation for a human being to adopt any system of morality. So let's say, as most people do, self-interest or enlightened self-interest. Okay, that's fine. If you make personal convenience the motivation for morality, that's fine. But there's a little problem. You see, human beings tend to be a little mercurial, a little capricious. Personal convenience changes, and it changes on situation. And sometimes following the rules is not advantageous. And so also, what if you can break those rules and not get caught and get the advantages of breaking those rules? What is the motivation to keep those rules if you can get away with something and it is advantageous for you to do so, or disadvantageous for you to keep following the rules in areas where you can't be discovered or you won't be discovered? And here's the problem. If you make a god of human convenience, well, the god of human convenience giveth, and the god of human convenience taketh away when it's no longer convenient. And we'll get into that. Whereas, if you need a moral system which has a motivation for human beings to follow with hope that it will ultimately fulfill their interests in this life and the next, to require another life. If you want a moral system that is backed up by, which is unchanging, it is objective, and it's backed up by a force that is all watching and is scrupulously just, then you can only have there is no other substitute for the belief in God in this matter. I don't care how invasive you make the state, even if you put cameras in people's houses like George Orwell kind of discussed. Of course, and you can make an argument for that, which is, okay, domestic violence is bad. One single incident of domestic violence is one incident too much. So in order to guarantee that no domestic violence happens, why not put a camera or cameras in everyone's houses? Because surely we cannot live in a world where a single incident of domestic violence can happen unpunished, unnoticed. So you can make a justification from a purely materialist perspective if you're trying to make human beings motivated to always follow the law at all times. You need a more totalitarian state to do so. However, can you trust the state? Will the state always be just? Will the state always be impartial? Well, if the state is governed by humans, no. But with God, God can always be just, always be impartial, and can be merciful when it's appropriate. So without this belief in God, a God that can know everything, that's omniscient, that's all-powerful, as well as has the ability to punish and reward the smallest of actions, of which no action can escape, there is no other substitute for the concept of God in this. And of course, if humans didn't create ourselves, and if we exist in a universe that didn't create itself, and we cannot sustain ourselves, nor can a universe that didn't create itself sustain itself, if you think about it, then therefore our very existence and our continued existence and the existence of all things which are created depend on the sustenance of a creator. You might, if you don't want to follow any moral system, you don't want to believe in any kind of morality, you don't care if there's no purpose or meaning to life, you're going to be the most nihilist of nihilists and solipsist of solipsists, that's fine. But even then, you still can't deny that God is required to explain the existence of the universe as well as to explain our continued existence. Now, I've made a bit of a bold claim there, which many individuals who might not believe that are just rankling to challenge. And certainly in the Q&A, I will give preference to those individuals. I was told there will be some individuals here who want to challenge that. I will give you preference because we can have an enjoyable back and forth. So today's discussion is really going to be based on four basic points: purpose of life, meaning to action, intellectual justification from our moral system, motivational consistency of any moral system. So can you provide any moral system which can generate a consistent motivation in human beings, or has it reason to generate consistent motivation in human beings? And fourth, we need God because we exist. Our existence, our very existence, requires the existence of God. So, dealing with purpose of life and meaning behind us. Now, I've generally really explained that if the universe was created by some mechanical process, some mindless process that caused us to come into existence, then there is no intention behind the universe. Nothing, not intended, it's just cause and effect, right? And if there's just cause and effect, and there's no intention, well then, there's no meaning, rhyme, or reason to anything that happens in the universe. Now people say, are you saying to me now that floods and massacres and genocides and killing, these become not bad anymore and these become good things? I say, no, I don't say that at all. I merely say that if you remove intention, remove meaning, then there is no good and bad to any of these things. These things just exist, just happen. There is no basis to judge them, and there is no rhyme or reason or meaning behind these things. Now, of course, this really leads on and is connected to intellectual justification for a moral system, which is a moral system for it to have the ability to say, this is good, this is bad. It has to have be based on an assessment of human purpose, to then judge whether humans are following that purpose or humans are not following that purpose. So without that, you don't have any basis to justify morality in any way, other than, and this leads us to the next point, convenience or what is in the interest of an individual. And this is really where the main discourse is going to happen here today. So people say that, okay, maybe I can't justify why we should be good, why we should be bad, and we can't justify concepts such as equality cosmologically. And I explain that equality, right, as an idea. We believe it as an idea. We also believe in justice and so on and so forth. All these metaphysical concepts, as in metaphysical being not physical but about the physical. These are judgments about the physical, metaphysical. So if you believe in justice and you believe in equality, you believe in metaphysical concepts that don't exist outside of the human brain if you're viewing it as a materialist. But equality is a problem because you can't justify that, because all creatures on planet Earth, especially human beings, and all atoms and molecules and so on, they're not identical. They're not the same. Humans aren't all identical, aren't all the same. Different humans have different intellects, different intelligences, different strengths, physical strengths, weaknesses, susceptibility to disease, susceptibility to cancer or to viruses or bacteria. Humans differ. Different lung capacities, different abilities to withstand ultraviolet radiation, and so other human beings can produce vitamin D from a little bit of sunlight compared to others, depending on your skin type. So we vary, we differ. So then the argument is, really, if we all differ in nature, and in nature, stronger animals generally survive and generally are able to hunt weaker animals if they are, predator and prey relationships are involved there, then where do you get the idea of equality from? Where does it exist? Because humans aren't identical. Even the Greek philosophers said that you should treat identical things identically, but non-identical things non-identically. And that was the Greek concept of equality. And that's why they justified what we would consider to be a lot of unequal practices in their time, in the ancient Greek time. So if you don't have a basis to justify equality, if you can't say we're all equal in worth in the eyes of God, then you have no basis to justify equality at all whatsoever. You can be a pure meritocrat. That's fine. If anyone who makes the grade into a certain job or position, they should be allowed to do so. Okay, that's great. But if they don't make the grade, then too bad. And you could then argue, okay, well, why do we separate or segregate the Olympics? Or gender segregate, or sports? That's not fair. Aren't we all equal? Shouldn't we all compete on an equal playing field? All humans on a purely meritocratic playing field? No. And they say, oh no, because, currently in Western culture, maybe in 100 years' time, the West might do that. But in Western culture, there's some acknowledgement that there's a difference, and it would be unfair because biology would discriminate and so on. That's the main reason why they don't allow different sexes to compete on the same playing field for the Olympics and so on in sports. So these are the kind of the issues here. But if you don't believe in equality, so if you don't believe in God, you don't believe that in any higher value than the material world isn't equal. It isn't identical. Some people say, maybe we're all equally human, and that is the basis for value. That might be a counter-argument that you might hear. Oh, we're all equally human, therefore we should all basically have the same equality. Well, that's actually arbitrary, because I could say that we're all equally matter like this chair, but does it mean that the chair now has an equality with us? You're picking one aspect of any matter and saying that, well, this is going to be the basis to determine equality. And equally human, what does that even mean anyway? You have to define human beings first. And of course, that might lead to eugenics. If you might say human beings defined as X, Y, and Z such. Or they have to have, they're not disabled, or they have a particular ethnic group, or a particular eye color or hair color. Where does it end? Where does it end? So there is no basis, unless you believe in religion, and you believe that all humans have the equal human souls in the eyes of God, at least initially, because obviously the righteous, those who choose to be righteous will be better than those who choose not to be righteous. However, if you don't believe in a soul and you don't believe in God, you have no basis to justify the idea of equality. But getting back to motivational consistency, so that's the next discussion, or point number 3. Can we generate a moral system that does not require God, but produces a consistent motivation to follow that morality? Well, let's look at it. So the argument is that humans, the enlightened human being, wouldn't want to live in an anarchic society with no rules. And so humans will create a society under some kind of a social contract that we all live together and we all follow these rules, because following the rules is better than just killing each other and survival of the fittest. So there goes the argument. So that people would not want to break the rules, because to break the rules would be to bring down the very society they depend on to survive. This is the argument. It's an argument for secularism, or some kind of secular argument which they believe don't require God. However, this argument is based on 3 big assumptions about human beings. The first assumption is that people will all have equal capability in that system and equal starting positions in that system. But we know that that doesn't work in human reality. Humans are born into wealth. Heck, a recent president of the United States, of who we should not name, was born into wealth, didn't earn that wealth like maybe Richard Branson did, but still had that privilege. And if you are rich, you are more likely to be the President of the United States of America than if you are poor. China is a bit different. If you are from a poor background, you're more likely to, statistically speaking, to be a leader of the Politburo, or in a Politburo, compared to if you're not poor. But this is the issue, that humans don't start off in equal positions. So then, why would people want to follow the rules if they're playing a game which is unequally stacked against them? I'll get back to that in a second. The second assumption is that people believe, the belief that people will, that the rules themselves would never get in the way of people's interests. So that there's the assumption that making these rules will never get in the way of people's interests. But what if they do? What if people want to cheat or use shortcuts when they're confident that nobody is looking? What if following the rules doesn't make you rich? And breaking those rules, being a drug dealer, is more lucrative than staying as a boring chemistry teacher who has to look after a child who's disabled. This is the Breaking Bad plot, of course. How could you argue against Heisenberg? How could you argue against, was it Walter White, if I remember the name correctly, that he shouldn't engage in drug dealing or in making crystal meth? How could you argue against that when, if he looks at his life, he realizes that staying as a chemistry teacher, he couldn't pay for his cancer treatments, he might not be able to look after a disabled son or leave anything behind if he passes away. How could you argue against him that to enter into crystal meth business is a bad idea? You couldn't. If he was clever and successful, and if you believed he's clever and successful, you couldn't argue against it. Now, some people might say that, well, you could argue that there's risk in that. There is risk. And maybe the risk of getting caught will stop people from doing that. And maybe it might deter many people. But they forget one thing. Our ancestors had to engage in risk to hunt for food. Human ancestors, every time they might have left their village or their town, they could have been mauled by a big cat or by any particular, or bitten by a snake or a spider or a whole number of things, depending on which geographical location you're in, or attacked by raiders or highwaymen, or a whole number of, or lost at sea. Our ancestors took risks to get material gain. So if that's the case, then how could you expect humans whose ancestors took risks to get material gain not to suddenly stop taking risks to get material gain, when clearly there is material gain to be gotten? And of course, the third and biggest assumption, the belief that breaking the rules would somehow destroy that society. It doesn't. Most crime will happen in human societies without the society collapsing due to people committing theft. If you commit theft, murder, or what have you, the entire society wouldn't collapse just because you broke the law, you individually broke the law. Of course, the argument is, well, if we all broke the law and we all did that, then surely society would collapse. Well, yes, but in practice, the majority of people won't do that. And of course, those who have an incentive to break the law always imagine themselves maybe to be more clever than the rest of society, or reasonably certain that they might not get caught. So then where is your motivation if you might not get caught? And some of these breaking the rules are not just, everyone always goes to murder and rape and so on as the most egregious rules. There are smaller rules that people break, that you'll probably break. When you finish your university, you're going to be applying for jobs, I should hope. Or maybe start your own business, that's better maybe. But if you apply for a job, many of you are going to, well, to use a Blairite concept, sex up your CVs. You're going to, your resumes. You're going to maybe do a bit of a slight remix on the CV and resume. And why is that? It's because you know you're competing with everyone else who's also doing that, for the most part. So many people, they tend to overinflate the importance of one of their previous jobs, or they exaggerate here and there, or they claim that working for their Uncle Bob in a garage was being a consultant. They will exaggerate these things because these small breakings of the rules don't bring society down. People say it's a victimless crime. Of course, people also can commit fraud without necessarily having to kill anybody or to rape anyone. People commit fraud. People try to do, cyber attacks and cyber hacking to extract money and so on. A whole number of things that people do. Of course, there's also another issue. People can also legally abuse the system without getting caught. So many stockbrokers and others like to gamble on subprime loans. Remember that in 2008, they gambled on subprime loans, offering it to very poor people who they knew most likely probably couldn't be able to pay it back, and it led to a catastrophe. It led to the bailing out of the banks. The banks got away with it scot-free, but everyone else had to pay the price in that. So where is the incentive to the bank to not do that anymore? There is no incentive for them to not do that anymore, because that's the system. They just game it, as they say. You game the system to your own advantage. Find the loopholes and exploit it, because, well, you're not going to bring society down by doing so. And of course, there are other issues that, when I mentioned we start off from different positions, people misunderstand the cause of oppression and the cause of people hating each other. You see, it's not some kind of Shakespearean villain like from Othello, who you had Iago just happens to hate Othello and just wants to be vindictive against Othello and does really nasty things to him. That doesn't really happen in real life, or in the comic book villains, right? It doesn't really happen in real life. Everyone generally justifies what they do. Every criminal act is justified according to the interests of the villain or the perceived circumstances. So, for example, let's use a more commonplace problem. So, some people, have you ever met someone and for some unknown reason they just happen to dislike you? For some unknown reason. Everyone's looking at each other. What are you touching fists for? It's like, that's our game, that's what we do. Well, they just happen to hate people. Hey, I've noticed this. So, if you see someone who's very rich or came from a rich family, people tend to hate these people as toffs. They say in English slang, oh, these people are toffs, they're arrogant, whatever. They make these assumptions about these people. And I've seen it with for some women. They look at each other and they start hating each other for no reason in some cases, because that woman looks better than me in one thing, and then they imagine that the person being arrogant about it and flaunting it, and it's like, oh, it's not fair. How comes she looks like that and I don't, or she has really nice eyes and I don't, or a whole number of things. Where does that all come down from? Where does that come from? Ultimately, it's, in a way, the belief in equality, or a kind of materialist understanding of equality. Why is that? If all humans are equal, how comes then some humans tend to have something more or better than what you might have? That's not fair. It's not fair that that lady is more attractive than the other girls, or this person has more wealth than the other guys, and it came from his family, he didn't even earn it. That's not fair. Or maybe someone did one quick venture and was very lucky and got lots of money, whereas other people do hard graft the rest of their life and never make that kind of money. That's not fair. People always argue it's not fair, and when they argue it's not fair, they justify being nasty to those people, because in their mind they're trying to equalize the vicissitudes of nature, the unfairness of nature. They're trying to equalize it by hating people, hating someone that has something that they don't. And that's from equality. That's from the idea, a materialist conception of equality. How could you justify it? I once went to California to speak at an event there, and while I was there, there was a mass shooting. No, it wasn't caused by me. And it was by this guy called Elliot Rodger. And I was quite shocked, because obviously, apparently in America, mass shootings are quite common. Not all of them are reported. But Elliot Rodger, he did a YouTube video to explain his motivations before he did his mass shooting. So he was upset that women wouldn't go with him, that he couldn't have a girlfriend, and yet those quote-unquote jocks that he says treat women badly and act like bad, the bad kind of guy, the bad boy, as they say, seem to attract the majority of women. Seem to have little harems for themselves, attracting the majority of women, whereas he, who called himself the perfect gentleman, doesn't attract women, couldn't attract women. So he said, and in his YouTube video, he says, I'm the perfect gentleman, and women don't realize this, that's why I'm going to kill him. So, clearly making his point, apparently. And he went around shooting some college girls and a few guys, and before he was stopped and killed by a police person. But for him, he had a belief of self-entitlement. Self-entitlement because in a society whereby guys are getting girls, I'm a guy, I should be able to get girls, but he couldn't, and he got angry and frustrated. And of course, a few other psychological issues what we don't know now, because obviously he's dead. But he then basically decided that if he couldn't, it would be more fulfilling for himself to be wrathful rather than kind. That was his issue. Now, thankfully, most people don't think like that. That's an extreme example, of course, but it just goes to show the motivations that are there in a purely materialist mindset. And of course, self-interest, when it does not have any consequence, motivates people to commit such crimes. Firstly, if you're part of the elite of any society, what's to stop you from discriminating against a minority? QED in France, it's now the Muslim community, of course, in America, the Muslim community as well. Those who are in power can, with impunity, discriminate against Muslims, stop them from getting on planes. In France, women who are the sisters here are wearing hijab. You couldn't do that at a French school. You could not wear your hijab in a French school. You can't pray in public. And, of course, you can't wear the niqab if you so chose to do so. And the majority of France was behind these policies. So how could you argue against this? Because they felt threatened, or it was against their culture, and they felt their culture was under threat from what they viewed was political manifestations of Islam. So because of that, they decided it was in their best interest to deny the minority their rights. And this has occurred throughout history. How could you argue against them? I would like to see anyone argue against a French secularist, who himself is a secularist, and tell them that that's not fair according to whatever conception of human rights. And you'll probably get the response, whose conception of human rights? According to who? According to humans? Well, we're humans. We're the citizens of France. You're not. We decided that the right to be like this. You couldn't argue against. Because they're the majority. You could say, you could say to them, how would you like it if someone did it to you? And say, well, we wouldn't like it, but we're in power, so no one's going to do it to us. So we can do it. When people are asked, how would you like it if someone did it to you? That assumes that person is weak enough to be worried about that threat. They might not be. Might be very strong. Might be very powerful. They don't care. Because no one's going to touch them. No one's going to say to Donald Trump, sorry, I named him now. No one's going to say to Donald Trump, you shouldn't ban Muslims because how would you like it if people banned you from the United States of America, which is probably very appealing to many Americans. But he would say, well, that's not going to happen. I know that will never happen. George Bush was under his tenure, America got away with torture of terror suspects, and George Bush hasn't been put in jail or put on trial even. Or neither of his friend Donald Rumsfeld been put on trial. They got away with it scot-free. So what motivation could you tell them to say torture is wrong? Well, they'll say, well, actually, if it works, it's not. It's not wrong. And this argument was produced by Sam Harris. Sam Harris who's a famous atheist, a notorious atheist perhaps, neuroscientist as well. He made an argument. He made an argument for torture against those who were against it. He said, look, if you are happy to drone strike, suspect terrorists around the world, then you should be equally happy to torture them if it makes America safer. And then he produced an argument called the ticking time bomb experiment. He said, what if I said, he argued that if you tortured one person to find out the location of a bomb, it would save 1,000 people. You might say, no, that doesn't justify it. He said, okay, what if I raise it to 10,000 people? And if you still say, no, that's still not acceptable, then he argued, what if I raise it to 100,000 people? Or 1 million people? Or 10 million people? He said soon, even the most diehard moralist would waver in those statistics. So his argument was that it's just how much, or which proportion are you going to basically accept that torture might be allowed if it's going to save life. And of course, the debate about torture, from both sides, the majority discourse was whether it works or not. Not that it is morally wrong, and whether it works, whether it saves millions of people's lives, should be irrelevant to the consideration that it's against the rights of human beings. No, of course not, because why is that? Morality, if you, in a materialistic perspective, morality is meant to serve human interests. So if it's no longer in our material interest to follow any moral rule, you can dispense with it. Why not? According to utilitarianism, should be allowed to. And utilitarianism replaced natural rights theory, the idea that humans have a natural right to liberty and so on. And then the atheists argued, obviously, David Hume and many others argued, natural rights. So Jeremy Bentham said that natural rights, the idea of natural rights is nonsense on stilts, basically. What rights? What, nature gives you rights? What, you're in a desert island? The lions and tigers and bears, if they were all living on a desert island, of course, would they respect your right to life? I don't think so. I don't think so at all. Nature doesn't care about your natural rights. So where do they come from? Well, they're only humanly constructed. And if they're humanly constructed, it will be according to human interests, then they can be taken away if it's in human interests. And of course, and here's one of the biggest injustices which will happen under an idea of a morality based on human self-interest, and the idea that we'll make a society where we'll follow rules and we'll follow these rules, society won't collapse, and that's in all our interest. Okay, what about other societies? Right? Surely a government or a country can, without any consequence, exploit, invade, attack, bomb as many other countries as they want, as long as they can guarantee that there's no consequence to them, or at least acceptable, no unacceptable consequences to them. So let's look at the ancestors of of the British Isles. Went to North America, went to Australia, displaced the natives. North America, Canada and USA, displaced the natives, took their land. What happened to them? Were they punished? Were they put on trial? Were they put in jail? Did the natives get their land back? Was there justice in this life for them? No. The natives still suffer persecution, oppression. They're put on these reservations which don't really have much economic benefit to them at all. Their land was consistently taken from them, and it was always justified. Well, it was firstly, you couldn't argue to a colonialist, don't do that. And they say, why? I have technological superiority over the natives. We have support of a developed industrial country. Why not? We'll get their resources, benefit us. Why not? Say, oh, you wouldn't like it if it happened to you. Well, no one can do it to us. So why not? You couldn't argue against them if it was from a material perspective. The British government didn't collapse because they did colonialism. In fact, it got stronger, got more powerful, more resources from doing colonialism, from exploiting. And Belgium made lots of money through the massacre of Africans in Central Africa, exploiting them, and in the most brutal ways. Some people say 18 million Africans died under the Belgian project to get rubber and so on and so forth, which was lucrative, and get the natives. Basically, the transatlantic slave trade took Africans from West Africa and put them in new colonies. However, when the Europeans realized that they were technologically superior to the Africans and they could just basically waltz in there, they did that, and they turned Africa into a slave colony in many of these countries, many of these areas. And in North Africa, like Algeria, the French actually tried to physically colonialize and push out the natives out of their lands. Actually tried to physically bring French people over to colonize Algeria. It didn't work, of course, because there was a resistance and a whole number of factors. But they did so. Of course, the British, in their colonial endeavors, invented the idea of the concentration camp. Wasn't the Germans, it was the British in South Africa who invented the idea. They put Boer civilians. Boers are descendants of the Dutch colonialists, but of course Britain took South Africa from the Dutch, and they didn't like that, so there was wars against British occupation, and the British realized they couldn't fight a guerrilla warfare against the Boers, because the Boers were very adept at that, so they just imprisoned their families, and thousands of men, women, mostly women and children, died in concentration camps. All for the greater glory of the British Empire, of course. How could you make a material argument against it? The British Empire didn't collapse because of that. They got stronger because of that. And that is the problem. Criminologists, does anyone here study criminology? Any criminology students? No? Okay, well, any psychology students maybe? Maybe psychology students? Must be one, two. No? Oh, you sir. Okay, excellent. You must have heard, perhaps in your studies, of what they call rational choice theory. The idea that people are motivated by rational choices considering their circumstances. And in that, criminals make a choice to commit criminal acts as a rational choice. They weigh the risk and the benefits outweigh the risks enough, and they go ahead to do the action because it's in their interests. What argument could you make? As the saying goes, it's only a crime if you get caught. There's also another adage, which is rules are made to be broken, but that's also an issue. Of course, some people say, at least with the most egregious crimes like murder and rape and so on and so forth, surely people's natural empathy would stop them from doing that. Humans have empathy. What about their natural empathy? Maybe that will stop people from doing that. That'd be a motivation. That's great. And it does. Stops most people from doing those nasty things. However, what could you say to sociopaths or psychopaths? Those who don't have empathy. Who will sleep at night just as soundly after committing a murder as if they gave candy to a child. Sleep just as soundly. How could you argue against them? What argument would you have for someone who has no empathy? You couldn't produce an argument. And these are for the most egregious crimes. Of course, most of what I discussed are smaller crimes or crimes committed by what was at the time normal people, as Hannah Arendt talked about the banality of evil. Said that at the time of Nazi Germany, as well as the British Empire, as well as during the slave trade, average people, quote unquote, from that society were engaged in those kinds of actions. Average people, not psychopaths or sociopaths in the sense of those who were just a fringe element of society, but it was actually the mainstream society was doing these very nasty things or approving of these things. Now, I usually cite some examples from statistics about morality, its effects on human motivation, and so on. But I'll save that for the Q&A for those who want to bring it up. However, I want to talk about how does belief in a God, how does that belief, more specifically in Islam, deal with a lot of these issues? Well, first and foremost, we see that in Islam there's a concept called rizq. Any Muslim knows what I'm talking about. Rizq. With rizq is a concept that whatever you earn, however you work, whatever you do, you earn a set amount. God has put for you a set amount of wealth, money, what have you, resources that you will make. Now, it doesn't mean that you do nothing, because Islam commands that you must obviously engage in pursuing your work, pursuing the good. But whether you did something good or bad, whether you pursue resources and interests and whatever, using good methods or bad methods, God has promised you the same amount of resource that you will get. The same amount of money and wealth and whatever you were interested in to pursue. Now, to an atheist or someone who doesn't believe in that, obviously, that they would reject that concept. They'll say it's just your faith. However, it's the faith that a person will never increase the wealth they'll get in their life by doing bad things, which is something that is a motivation against doing bad things, because a Muslim knows they wouldn't increase their wealth. They couldn't increase their wealth. All the wealth they were destined to get by doing a bad thing. So might as well just stick to doing good things, you'll get the same amount of wealth. You'll get the same amount. We also see that in the Quran, it talks about God has made people in different ranks to test them by what they received. And what that means is that those who are born into families with wealth, for example, or those who are born as geniuses, they were geniuses, or what have you, whatever positive blessing or aspect that they get, they will be expected to do more with that. They will expect it to have responsibility to those who don't. So those who have more wealth are going to be asked about on the Day of Judgment what they did to alleviate poverty and help those who didn't have that wealth. Yeah, those who were more intelligent will be asked how did they use that intelligence that they were given to help those who didn't have that level of intelligence. How did they use it in the best of ways? And in all things, and if those who are either handsome or beautiful or what have you, will be asked whether they didn't succumb to being arrogant about this and flaunting it in public, but whether they saved it for their spouses, as a good thing for their spouse, and they resisted the temptation to flaunt it. You know what they say, if you got it, flaunt it. Did they resist it? Did they resist these things? Every single benefit or advantage God gives you, there will be a commensurate responsibility. So ultimately, there is a balance. To those who are given more will be expected. To those given less will be expected by God. This actually gives a lot of ease to the believer, because he knows, or she knows, that whatever they don't have is less of a burden on the day of judgment for them. And those who have it will are tested more than those who don't have, who haven't been given any of these things. So we see this. We also see that God in the Quran promises that those who follow the good morals will have success in this life. God will give them success in this life. It's not only Islamic belief, but obviously I'm here talking about from Islamic perspective. For example, in the time of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the pagan tribe of the Quraysh, the Arab tribe of the Quraysh, they used to have disdain for anyone whose firstborn child was a girl. They had disdain for that. It was viewed as a bit of a shame. You know, if you are a person meant to be of great lineage, they expect that person's firstborn would be a male to inherit and will be strong, and so on and so forth, which caused many of the Quraysh to kill their firstborn child if their firstborn happens to be female. And of course, they expect that males would produce and supply the family with work and also with physical protection. So males were more valued at that time. However, the Quran refuted this argument and said, do not kill your daughters for fear of want. God will provide for you and for them. So as a Muslim, we had a motivation to rid ourselves of this backward, pagan mentality of the 7th century Arabia. And instead, the Quran talks about those fathers who they only have children who are female, and if they are happy with this, God will forgive their sins and admit them into paradise. It reversed it. It told Muslims to be happy about this, to be happy to have females. And if all your children are females and you are happy with this, then God will forgive your sins and enter you into paradise. This is the discussion. Now, if you think that doesn't apply in a materialistic society, surely in a materialistic society they wouldn't have any motivation to disdain having females. Well, just look at India and China. We see there's a lot of problems currently with female infanticide in those countries, and these countries are very secular. China is certainly very secular, and the problem was based on a kind of very materialistic logic, which is that if your poor families couldn't afford to keep females who they thought wouldn't work or couldn't work or what have you, or wouldn't be as economically productive as males, so they would kill female infants or have abortions in that sense, and prefer males. And this obviously Islam completely refuted and actually gave motivation to go against that very sick practices and very sick mentality. Also, what about helping your enemies? According to a materialist perspective, how is it in your interest to help your enemies? Your enemies are against you. Those who don't like you, those who hate you, why would you help them? Or why would you refrain yourself from bad-mouthing them when they're bad-mouthing you? How would you deal with that as a materialist? You couldn't argue against to a materialist to say, help your enemies, be nice to your enemies, because they don't like their enemies. Why would they do that? But we see in the Quran it says, and not equal are the good deed and the bad, and repel evil by that deed which is better, and thereupon the one whom between you and him is enmity will become as though he was a devoted friend. Another verse the Quran says, let them pardon and overlook. Would you not love for God to forgive you? God is forgiving and merciful. We also see the motivation to not punish, to not have punishments which that require so much evidence that they punish innocent people. You could argue that in a country or state, it's better to have a punishment system that makes sure we capture all criminals, even if that means some innocents will be accidentally caught in the net. Whereas the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ said, verily it is better for the leader to make a mistake forgiving the criminal than for him to make a mistake punishing the innocent. So we see these metaphysical motivations to do what you think is actually counterintuitive. It's counterintuitive to a materialist. Why would you not get jealous about someone who has more than you? Why not undermine them to teach them a lesson about equality? Why not do so? Why actually help someone who hates you and is bad-mouthing you? Why would you keep silent in the face of someone bad-mouthing you? Why not equally disrupt their reputation, undermine their reputation, in order that people don't have credence to what they're slandering you with, so that people don't believe them anymore? Of course, that's materialistic thinking. But you need to to be told, you need to believe that doing those things are bad and that God will give you eventual justice, that following the rules will give you eventual success in this life and the next, that you should forgive others so that you may be forgiven in the hereafter, your sins. Without this, there is no antidote to materialistic motivation to commit crime. And I'll conclude with also the discussion on do we need God to exist? And this is the final point. Do we need God to exist? I'd argue that we do. And how is that? Is because people say, if you make a very bold claim, you need a very bold evidence. You need evidence that's extraordinary. So extraordinary claim, extraordinary evidence. The onus is upon you to provide proof that God exists. Some people argue proof God doesn't exist, which I think is not a very good argument. The real argument is really that there is a burden of proof, the burden to explain why the universe exists rather than nothing. Now, the argument might be, okay, well, the universe exists, it just exists, accept it, what have you. Why ask further questions? Well, I'll say, I don't have that blind faith. I want to question, I want to analyze. Of course, the universe has rules and laws and has a finite existence, has limits and so on and so forth. All these, it has matter and energy to certain proportions. They interact with certain regularities, which we call laws. So we want to ask, why do these things exist in a certain proportion that they do? And generally, there's two arguments. Either something created them that way, deliberately, or something just made them mindlessly. Now, in order to explain the anthropic principle, which is the noticing by physicists or astrophysicists, that the laws of the universe are so finely tuned to allow life to exist in this universe. In order to counter that, the argument was invented of the multiverse theory, which was that there is something making an infinite variety of universes, infinite amount of universes of every particular possible combination, that inevitably you're going to get our universe that allows life. Well, there's a little problem with that. Firstly, why is this thing making universes? Still hasn't been explained. Why is the multiverse making universes? Why? What's making it do so? And of course, this brings a further problem, a further actually issue. You see, the multiverse, you still haven't explained why the multiverse makes our specific universe. Like, are you saying, okay, rolling the dice, yeah? It's a roll of the dice every universe. All right, it's great. Who's rolling the dice? What's rolling the dice? And what determined the dice result? Still a problem there. Eventually, you have to get to a point, you have to get to a start point where something decided it would be in a particular amount or a particular rules and constants and laws. It has to be this particular amount and not something else. Now, some people argue, quite perhaps facetiously, that they say, I don't believe in God, like I don't believe in goblins, fairies, and unicorns. Very common argument I've heard. Very arrogantly, I don't believe in God, like I don't believe in goblins, fairies, and unicorns. Oh, really? Okay, so what created the universe? Well, to have life? Well, there's infinite amount of universes, infinite possibilities, and so on and so forth. And so our universe was obviously inevitable to come into existence. Oh, that's great. Okay, fine. So you say there's infinite universes, infinite amount, every variety and possibility. And they say, yes, there is infinite amount, infinite possibility. I think the brother knows where I'm going with this. Or you just, no, I thought he was nodding. He's like, yes, I know you're going with this. Okay. So then if there's an infinite amount of universes, with infinite variety and possibility, there has to be one universe where a horse has a horn. Another universe where humans are very small and they have wings. Another universe where some kind of reptilian green thing with pointy ears and what have you exists. Basically, if you believe in multiverse theory, you believe that goblins, unicorns, and fairies exist somewhere. They actually exist. And that Lord of the Rings and Game of Thrones happen somewhere. Because infinite possibilities, right? Every possibility. Everything. You have to believe that. So the problem is, once you get rid of God, you start believing in fairies, goblins, and unicorns. So I would say the only argument that can be brought, and this is not also an argument that I raised, but many astrophysicists who came up with the idea of the multiverse, like Paul Steinhardt, he made this point. So he basically explains that he constructed the idea of a multiverse concept to explain fine-tuning, to explain the problem of fine-tuning. And here's what he said. It's called inflation theory, because the whole point of inflation was to get rid of fine-tuning to explain features of the original Big Bang model that must be fine-tuned to match observations. The fact that we had to introduce one fine-tuning to remove another was worrisome. This problem has never been resolved. But my concerns really grew when I discovered that due to quantum fluctuation effects, inflation is generically eternal, and as others soon emphasized, this would lead to a multiverse. So his argument was that he tried to get rid of or explain away fine-tuning of this universe by introducing the idea of an inflationary model, an idea of multiverse, but he came right back to explaining why does this universe, why was it still made the same way it was, even amongst the infinite variety of other universes? Why did the multiverse create our universe in its particular way? Who rolled the dice, and what determined the dice roll? It was still a problem. Even if you argued dice rolls determine everything, who rolled the dice couldn't be got rid of. So I conclude that if you want to ask why do humans need God, if you believe that humans don't need a purpose of life, they don't need meaning, they don't need intellectual justification to their morality, and they don't need a motivational consistency to their morality, so who cares about morality, who cares about purpose and meaning, you still can't escape the necessity that we need God to create the very universe of which our bodies are formed from the very building blocks of. Thank you for listening. We'll go straight to Q&A.
Yeah, we'll take some from the phone and some from the crowd, inshallah. Okay, guys, like we said, please keep questions respectful. You can ask anything, word it in the right way. We'll start with the floor, and then we'll go on to take questions from the phone. So, does anyone have a question?
Questions, comments, or contentions. I give special priority to contentions.
Okay. Maybe not. We'll start with the phone then. Okay, Sheikh. So I've got the question. If there is an all-loving God, why is there suffering? Why are people born in this world only to live a life of agony and pain?
Okay. So the argument is, if there's an all-loving God, why is there suffering and pain? And this is really underpinned by a massive assumption. That human purpose is somehow to have unlimited, unremitting, and infinite pleasure in this universe. That's the assumption. It's an assumption that was really born during the rise of liberalism as a philosophy. And liberalism that states that the purpose of human beings is the pursuit of happiness, and happiness is defined as constant satisfaction of the senses, as John Locke would put it, and as Thomas Hobbes would also put it. So, now, out of this assumption, they came with this assumption that the purpose of humans was to pursue happiness via constant satisfaction of their instincts and their drives. And when they saw that the universe, they believed in God, but when they saw the universe didn't fit that assumption, they didn't say, maybe our assumption's wrong. No. Many of those left Christianity became atheists and said, no, God must not exist. Say, wait a second. If your assumption's wrong and it doesn't fit the universe, then, so if you make an assumption, it doesn't fit the universe, your assumption is false. It's wrong. I'd say that humans exist in a world which has pleasure and pain. We have nerves. Nerves in our bodies transmit pleasure and pain. Our brains can assimilate and understand pleasure and pain. That which made us, intended us to have those two sides of our existence. So the real question is, what is pleasure and pain about? Why do we have these motivational sensations? We know that just looking at biology or nature, that you get pain which is meant to avert you from something bad, and pleasure to encourage you to something which, let's say, might superficially appeal to some particular sensation or sense. So we know that even from looking at the material world, that pain and pleasure are meant to motivate you to something else. They're meant to drive you to something else. Thanks for coming. Cheers. I think I scared them out the room. I'm not that scary, mostly. So if we can conclude that biological creatures exist with pain and pleasure in order to motivate them to fulfill reproduction, survival, and so on and so forth, then why not, on the grander scheme of things, God creating pain and pleasure in human experience for us to attain a higher purpose? And that higher purpose would be to worship God, whether it's convenient or inconvenient. If people didn't suffer, where is the motivation or the test for humans to actually help those people who are suffering? Right? If disease doesn't exist, then where is the test for those people who don't have disease to find cures to help those who do? Or where, if unfortunately people who might suffer from diseases and their parents are worried for them, where is a test for good parents if children didn't get sick, for example? Where is a test? So God created all these things for a higher reason, a higher purpose. And if they didn't exist, then there would be no test. No test for you to choose to do what God ordained for us, what is our purpose, what is good, rather than do what is bad because it's not convenient anymore. So if there wasn't inconvenience, there wouldn't be any tests. So if you think that God is somehow not loving because there's pain and pleasure in this universe, then you don't understand God, and you don't understand this universe, and you don't understand human reality. Because surely this God is loving, which is why He gives us the opportunity to be tested, for us to do good and be rewarded. And of course, we say people say God is all loving, which makes an assumption that that God could only love and could never obviously punish those who do bad. Obviously, if something is all loving, it couldn't punish those who are rapists and murderers. They couldn't, because it's all loving, right? So we don't say all loving. This is let's say non-Islamic description. God is loving. He loves those who do good. He loves those who intend good. Those who want to do bad, kill, oppress, and so on, then He doesn't love those people that do that. That's what the Quran says. It's what the Old Testament says as well. Despite what you might hear from some evangelical Christian angles, the Old Testament says this, and it's clearly the nature of this is also discussed in the New Testament too. But that's a different discussion, which I'm not going to go into. But pain and pleasure just indicate that we have a higher purpose than just gorging our bellies and getting infinite pleasure and satisfaction. Any other questions, comments, or criticisms?
Any questions from the floor?
I think I've cowed them into silence. Oh, is
Yeah.
sister there?
Yeah. So great speech. Thank you for that. And please take this as I'm engaging with your logic rather than a critique.
Please.
So the topic of the talk was why do we need God?
Yeah.
But why did you choose to answer it from an ontology based basically on Western notions like equality? Even when you chose to interpret rizq, you went for earnings rather than the idea of blessing, which is kind of, in my opinion, closer to rizq. And then you ended by that we need a God because we wouldn't exist if we do not believe in a God. But then
No,
I
if
can
God didn't exist, we wouldn't exist, is what I said.
Yeah, sorry, that's what I meant. But I can use the same argument that you use for the minorities. Like Trump can basically tell you I exist and I'm not an unbeliever, and I'm an unbeliever. So it's kind of like your logic is kind of stuck in notions that are basically based on an ontology that doesn't work for the idea of Rabb al-Alameen. It is an idea that's basically not built on the same notions that you have chose to defend the existence of God. What I'm trying to say is, why didn't you start from what does it mean to have a God and then end up by the purposes of Islam or of morality as something that kind of have a higher purpose rather than like being in the finite world.
Okay, so if I'm getting your idea, you're saying that if someone who doesn't believe in God and doesn't believe in Islam or religion, let's say, that person wouldn't have a motivation to be good like you said, Donald Trump is cited as an example. Well, that's precisely my argument. My argument is that if you're not a believer, then the question on your motivation are going to be mixed. So they can't produce a consistent morality, a consistent and a justification if your basis is materialistic. If you're going to come from a materialistic perspective. As to the idea of God, and explaining it from the argument that we need God because we wouldn't exist if God doesn't exist. The reason why is because this topic, which is not the first time this topic has been come up with in any university, is usually an argument I've seen it between Christians and atheists. And the argument is, does believing in God produce any pragmatic benefit? Do my profit margins go up if I believe in God? That's the argument that is always assumed. And I don't want to discuss it because I thought that's actually very, very conceited for humans to ask, do we need God, and measure that on if God gives us material benefit in this life, actual material. But it's very conceited. If God didn't exist, we wouldn't exist. Fundamentally, that's why we need God. That's how we should answer that question. Do we need God? Well, if God didn't exist, you wouldn't exist. It's kind of like there was a discussion by, I think, Imam Ghazali, so a classical scholar, and he discussed a person who said a person who is no longer underneath the law, underneath any obligation to follow God. That basically they should to do so they should basically be not on this earth, not in the universe. They should not be made, not have anything that is made by God, and they should be able to also themselves not be made by God. And if they could fulfill all those criteria, they're under no obligation to follow God and obey God. Of course, that's impossible. And that was his argument. So we need God because God created us. But my argument about morality, and when I asked you about rizq, was because, and I discussed it on the issue of wealth, is because we're discussing it to those who have materialistic basis. You can't tell materialists to say, you should believe in rizq because you get blessings. Because they don't care about blessings. Blessings is immaterial to them. It literally is immaterial to the materialist. But they understand wealth. And they understand the motivation to steal or to, let's say, game the stock exchanges to make money. And they do so because they believe that if they don't do some of these bad things, they're going to lose. They're not going to get the wealth that they were meant to get. They don't even believe they're meant to get any wealth. They get as much wealth as they think they can get by using these tactics. So in order to persuade these people, that to give them a motivation not to do so, you have to show them that in the big scheme of things, your wealth was always fixed. So pursue it in the good way, not the bad way. And that's why I gave that argument from that angle. Because I'm not here to persuade the believer. I'm here to persuade those who don't believe. Understand? So that's why I'm gearing it to them. But thanks for your question, your question. Sister on top there.
So a bit linked to this response here. I wanted to ask you about, this might turn into a long answer. The idea, you introduced this idea of destiny, that you get what is written for you. But then, does that not go against the idea of reward? And if you do good, you're rewarded for doing good.
Okay, so this is really what they call a qada wal qadr argument, which is why do you have any choice in your actions, or does God just compel you like a robot to what have you? And this is a very big philosophical discussion within Islamic discourse throughout centuries. And I suppose I couldn't really argue from one position or another without breaking my no madhab preference rule, which I can't. I'm madhab neutral in my public discussion, so I can't. Madhab, for those who don't want any non-Muslims here, means school of thought, so I can't argue from any school of thought. But what I would argue is this, maybe from a rational perspective, which I think all schools of thought would agree on, which is we can't really comprehend how God sustains, how an infinite thing sustains the finite, how the finite exists. What does free will mean and choice? How, these things are not, you can't find them in the universe. You can't detect these things. While I would concede that neuroscience has shown, and actually I would say has actually confirmed the Islamic perspective, that most of what you believe is choice is really just calculations in your mind. However, tests, when your mind tells you one thing and your heart tells you something else, that allows you to have free will. Because you have now two choices. You have two motivations that tug you in two directions. Which is why I believe God gives tests. Tests are the means by which God gives you the ability to manifest free will. However, the question is, what's the point if God has willed the future and so on? Well, here's the issue. Firstly, we don't know the future. Right? We don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, what's going to happen in 5 minutes, what's going to happen next week. So, as far as we're concerned, as far as humans, from the human perspective, it's undecided. Right? But God, who sees the full picture because He created it, is telling us that whatever you did, whether you did good or bad, you still got the same amount. Because He could know and could figure from the beginning of the universe everything in the right way, in the right proportions, such that if you had chosen to follow the good methods, you would have received the same reward as choosing the bad methods. So He knows the bigger picture, but we can't see that because our perspective of this bigger picture is very small and very finite, and it's stuck in time. And we don't see the causality, the ripples of all our actions. We don't see all of them. But God does. Of course, if you want a more specific answer, or a more philosophical answer, one could argue that God's knowledge is infinite, it's unlimited. He knows what you would do if you truly had the same free will that He does. So, He brings about the choice that you would have made if you truly had free will like Him. But because we're not like Him, we're finite creatures, we don't have God's free will. God's free will is not compelled by anything. Whereas our free will is limited to cause and effect. So we need to have choices to make any decision. So God knows which choice we would make because His knowledge is not limited by time or space or anything. He knows what we would make, and He allows us to make that choice that He knows we would make. So in a way, we depend on Him to make a choice, but at the same time, He never compelled you to make one choice or the other. He just allowed you to bring that choice into fruition. It's very hard to bring an analogy from the finite world to bring that, but it's more like if you're playing, let's say, a computer game. You might be playing a computer game, but you depend on the electricity and the processor for a lot of what happens in the game. But the processor in the computer doesn't compel you to make any particular choice, right? But it facilitates your choice. So God facilitates your choice, and that's why we depend on Him. And He in a way, in one way, allows us. Without Him, we couldn't make a choice. We couldn't have any free will. Obviously, our very existence wouldn't exist if He didn't constantly sustain us. But see, He gives us permission to make the choice, and He brings that choice into existence. But it was not compelled by ourselves. So I think I've answered in a way that doesn't step on any madhab's toes, as much as possible, a school of thought's toes. But I hope that answers your question. Or do you have any comebacks from that? Or do you have any points?
No, it's just that you said that having morality gives. So the fact that it's already written how much wealth you're going to get is a motivation for Muslims not to do bad. But then it's flip side. Why would anyone not do good if they're going to get the same thing?
Well, the situation is if you choose to do bad to get the same amount of wealth, you'll get punished as a Muslim. You know that you'll get punished in this life or the next, and the next, for doing bad. Whereas if you do good to get the same amount of wealth that you know you're going to get, then you'll get rewarded in this life and or the next. So that's the motivation. See, God doesn't allow any loopholes in human experience. There's no loopholes. You might think, okay, look, I've heard this logic from unfortunately even some individuals who claim to be following religion. They say, look, I play the lottery. I know it's bad to play the lottery, but if I win, I could give that money to my family, help do so much good. So God understands. God will understand, right? That's a very common argument. In fact, I've heard, unfortunately, but it doesn't. Because rizq, if that person understood the rizq, they'd know that they'd still get the amount that they'd get if they played. And I know that person for a very long time, and they haven't won. They haven't won anything, right? You could have argued that they could have actually made money by not playing and saving that £1 or £10 or whatever they spend. They saved that up, and they would have had some money. You know, that's guaranteed to win if you don't play. You understand? So that's the motivation there. Is that why do a bad thing to get something that you'd get anyway doing a good thing and face the consequence of doing it when you do the bad thing? Why do so? When you'd get the same reward anyway, why not even take the risk? Why just take the punishment for getting something that you would have got it, doing it good, avoiding the punishment.
I'll take the next question from the phone, and we'll come back to the floor in a second. So 2 questions are kind of related. Is there an argument for an entity other than a monotheistic God that could sustain a universe such as ours? Why is it only a monotheistic God that we're talking about? And a linked question. The title of today's talk is Do We Need Allah? Or do we need God?
Yeah.
Is there any argument for Allah specifically, or could this apply to any other Christian God or a Jewish God or any other God?
Well, a lot of my arguments are brought from Islamic texts. And I would concede, to be fair to any Christians here, I can't visibly identify any Christian, but any Christians or Jews here, that in their text there is similar. There is similar texts that say the same things in Christian in the Bible and in the Quran, so in the Old Testament, although the Tanakh as it's called, although maybe not in the same formulas and so on and so forth, but generally the same message. But of course it would be the same message because it comes from the same author. More by and large, anyway, at least the message generally comes from the same author. The Quran or Islam is not going to be radically different from Christianity and Islam, and Judaism. Of course, we'd expect it to be a lot of it the same. However, there is a difference with the Trinitarian concept of God. Of course, the Jewish concept of God. I mean, Jews worship the same God that Muslims worship. It's not a different God. I don't need to prove to a Christian or a Jew that we worship our God is better than their God or exists and their God don't exist, because we worship the same God. We disagree with some of the Trinitarian conceptions of God and so on, but that's a different discussion. But that links on to the question you asked before that, which is, how do we know there isn't more than one God? How do we know that there's only one God? I think that's a better question to ask. So first and foremost, as Muslims, we believe that any people throughout history who've worshipped one God that does not look like a human being or an animal or a creature and so on, worships the same God that we worship. And the people that do so are called the Hunafa. They are the rightly inclined individuals. Throughout history, the monotheists throughout history. At the time of the Prophet Muhammad, before his prophethood, there was an individual who worshipped one God, rejected polytheism, and he was viewed as he was asked about the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and on the Day of Judgment he was basically going to be described that he would come as an ummah of one, a believing people, but only one, consisting of only one person, because he didn't have access to revelation, or at least to Islam, but he believed in only one God and didn't associate partners or make anthropomorphize God, and so he worships the same God that we worship, and he wouldn't have to fear on the Day of Judgment because he followed what his mind took him to. And this really brings to the point: how do we know? And it's very simple. If you believe that God is infinite and unlimited, has no limits, infinite, and that He made all things, how could He share anything with another God? Because a second God would limit the power of God. And of course it would also bring the question, why is there 2 gods or 3 gods? Why 2 or 3 or 4? Where does this number come from? Because we know, rationally speaking, that if there's more than one of something, they had a common origin, or they were made by something else. If there's more than one, it was made by something else. So then there'd be a higher God. And what you find in most polytheism concepts is there's always a head god, or a higher god, or a first god. Ancient Greece, it was Kronos who actually made Zeus, and then Zeus imprisoned him for some reason. Ra in ancient Egypt, I believe it is Brahman in the Hindu concept, and then all the other gods are meant to be manifestations or avatars of Brahman, but there's different conceptions of Hinduism and so on and so forth. So you always see that there's a head god who made the multiple other gods. But in Islam, and I think in anyone who kind of uses the rational kind of critique of this, or just looks at this, is that if you believe God's infinite, He can't share His power with anyone else because He'd be finite, He'd be limited. And the Quran has a great argument it makes to Trinitarian Christians, all due respect to any Christians here, of course, which is that who would be in the least of power if God was to destroy Jesus, Mary, and the entire world? Who would have the least power in that conflict, that clash? It would be Jesus, Mary, and the entire world would have the least of power, because God has no limitations of what He can do. no limits. So if there's more than one God, it would bring to mind the question, who made the second God, third, fourth, and in that particular number. And if there was more than one God, God wouldn't be God. God would be limited by the other God. And then, of course, the question is, if it's limited, then what made it? What made those limitations in that particular way? So, if God is unlimited, he can be the only one. And that's the only rational argument the only rational conclusion you can come to. And how we know that can only be the case, and you don't need revelation for that. You don't need revelation for this. You don't need the Bible, the Tanakh, which is the Old Testament, or the Quran, to know this, to come to this yourself. You don't need it. Which is why, I suppose, the Quran expects mankind to already know this, and won't take excuses on the Day of Judgment for those people who should have known better. And those people say, no, we just follow what our parents were on. That's not an acceptable excuse, because you should have used your mind and come to the rational understanding that there's only one God, and God doesn't look like a creature and doesn't share his power with other gods. So that would be my response to that question. Gentleman at the front.
So you answered polytheism really well. What about a monotheistic deist God?
Okay, so the gentleman says, what about a monotheistic deist God? Deism, for those who don't know, is basically a God who creates the universe and then leaves it to his own devices. It creates it like a wind-up doll and then lets it walk by itself and doesn't care. Well, there are the other conceptions of that. Maybe God does create the universe and made all the laws and things and so on, but doesn't care about us in particular, because the universe is big. We are a speck on top of a speck on top of circling a speck in the cosmic size of things. Our sun is pretty small as a star compared to some of the stars that are available out there, red giants and what have you. So why would God be concerned about us? So I'm going to answer that in reverse order. Well, firstly, when people ask, well, God made the universe, all right, fine, but why would he care about us? We're just a small, tiny speck in the universe. Why would he care about us? This makes the assumption that God's attention span or his knowledge is limited and finite. That he needs secretaries, or MPs to represent different areas of the universe and ultimately relate to him information. Which, I might add, is that the assumption behind a lot of polytheistic religions. That you can't, the head God, he's too distant from us. He's too distant. We need to worship these intercessors who will be the intermediaries between us and God, because God's too distant for us. He wouldn't know, he wouldn't care about my issues. I have to worship my local representative idol, my local rep, and the electoral bar or whatever, right? It makes the assumption that God is limited and his knowledge is limited, and he wouldn't intimately know to an infinite degree the smallest and tiniest speck of matter, which one could argue is to the degree of Planck time and Planck space. It's a physics term. It's hypothesized the smallest unit of space. The smallest is Planck space, and the smallest unit of time is Planck's time. So we assume that God wouldn't know the smallest thing to the infinite degree, and that's what the Quran says. The Quran says that in many verses and in narrations of the Prophet Muhammad, that God is aware of the smallest, some people translate it as the smallest atom and smaller. You see, so God is aware of this. Of course he would be, because if he's infinite, how could his attention span be limited? Or his knowledge be limited? So that's that point. The first point, which is, how do we know that God just made the universe and is now leaving it alone? Well, for the very fact that once God has made the universe, depended on God to make it, to make the universe, and we depend on God. The substance in our very bodies depended on God ultimately to create it. But if we couldn't bring ourselves into existence, how can we sustain ourselves in existence? You think that just once you're made, you're now separate? Because what's the smallest unit of matter? The smallest unit, or even forget about the smallest unit of energy. It's the smallest quanta of energy. Okay, what's that made out of? Because if you say there's an infinite, it goes to an infinite smaller degree of matter. Well, if it goes for infinity, it wouldn't exist. At some point, there has to be a point where it stops. Somebody say, and a point where this is what it is. And the question is, well, what's giving its attributes, its characteristics? What is defining that? What is giving that existence? maintaining it? What is it? Right? So I would say that we need God to sustain us. And the fact that we haven't popped out of existence means that God is sustaining us till this very point in time. So the issue is God hasn't left us alone because we still need Him to exist. So He's still supplying the sustenance of our very existence. And added to the fact that His knowledge is also infinite, He's intimately involved in our affairs and create a whole universe that would intend for us to come into existence and so on. That doesn't show a deist God. That shows a God that has intent and is involved in us and obviously intends for us to do something.
Do you want to come back to that again?
All good.
Okay. Any other questions from the floor? Some questions on the phone?
So you made the argument for monotheism, but then following up, so you have multiple religions that claim to be monotheist, Judaism, Islam, Sikhism. So at the end of the day, why Islam?
Okay, so the question is why Islam compared to Sikhism, Judaism, so on and so forth. This is, in some ways, it's a big question because I generally go through sometimes a process of elimination, going through different religions, saying why not this, why not that. And how I came to Islam was through a process of elimination of every other alternative. I became Muslim like I think many other people become Muslim, which is they nothing else makes sense except Islam. What I would say is that if you could view Islam as a theory, as people view scientific theories, not only does Islam explain everything of human existence, the universe, everything, without any internal contradictions or contradictions with the universe, but also you realize it could have only been Islam and nothing else. It could have only been the explanation that provided by Islam. It couldn't have been any other way. And if God intended, if that's the only possible explanation, then and there are people who arise with that very specific explanation, then I will take those people in their word because I know that God intended those people to arise with that very specific explanation, which we call prophets. So God intended the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ to produce the explanation, relate it to us. He intended Isa alayhi or Jesus to relate that to us, and Moses to relate the same explanation to us. So if people are producing the same, are coming up with the same explanation, the exact same explanation, and it's the only possible explanation that could be to everything that exists, then I will take them at their word. I will take them, because it could have only been like this. So, when every time I see a picture on TV of people, of children suffering to death, being starved, and, with bulbous stomachs and heads because their bodies have shrunk. When I see that, I know hell exists. And not hell exists for the child. No. Hell exists for everybody else that let that child get to that. Hell exists for everybody else. Hell will exist for them, as in they will have to account for that. Someone's going to account for that. Because I know that everything was intended to exist in this world. And if there are people who are suffering and never even had the chance of life because of our ineptitude and our neglect as collectively as humanity, then I know for certain hell exists. Because hell exists for the rest of us, letting that child die. And so Islam was the only natural explanation for all these things that I could see. And I've only explained a little bit of the rationality behind these points, the consistency, but every other aspect of Islam is just as consistent and just as consistent with the universe and reality as well as within itself. And no other explanation provides that.
Just so you know, so we've got the room till 9 o'clock, so we will end by 9. But I'll keep asking questions as long as you're happy to answer them. Yep. So, as arts of God, we cannot say we do not need God, because without an artist, there would not be the art. But does God need us? Why did He create us?
Okay, so the question is a good question. So thank you for coming. So it's a good question, which is why did God make us? Does God need us? It's a very common question some people ask. And quite simply, no, He didn't. But that assumes that God makes things because He needs it. He doesn't make things because He needs it. We assume it because as human beings we make things because we need it. It helps us, benefits us, or we want it in the very minimum. Whereas God makes things because he wills it. And people find it hard to understand because we understand other finite beings with a model of psychology that something has a motivation and they make an action to fulfill that motivation. So there's something behind the choice. There's a pre-existing motivating factor that individual has to choose and decide how to fulfill it. But if God is the first cause, is the beginner of all things, then there is nothing behind him. There's nothing previous to God motivating God to do anything. So quite literally, when I say God has the truest free will, God's free will is real free will because he's not compelled to do anything, nor is he motivated to do anything by any unchangeable nature or what have you. He decided to do it because he decided to do it, quite literally from zero, from nothing. He decided to make the universe and decided to make us and decided to make a universe of finite things. And if you think about it, what does the universe indicate? The first thing that the universe points to. Anyone? What do you think is the main and primary thing that the creation of a universe points to? What is it evidence of? Sorry? Evidence of life? Well, so before life on Earth, there was no. Well, before, let's say, the first 2 seconds of the Big Bang, there was no life. So what was it still an evidence of? Assuming the Big Bang is correct, of course. But
Creation.
sorry, creation by who?
Creator.
By Creator. The universe fundamentally is evidence of the Creator. Well, forget whether it is life or not, or humans or not. Fundamentally, every atom that exists is evidence of the Creator. So all we can argue is that God intended that. God willed that. And that's it. And so we are part of this universe. And we too must be evidences of the Creator. Must be referring back, must be worshipping Him, because that's what the fundamental building blocks of our very bodies are. They bear evidence to the Creator. So God doesn't need us at all. The Quran talks about it so many times. God doesn't need you in the slightest. It wouldn't hurt Him if you all turned away from Him. It wouldn't hurt Him in the slightest. It would hurt yourselves, not Him. Doesn't need your worship. Sometimes some Hollywood films like to portray that these gods only exist because humans believe in them. If humans didn't stop believing in them, they'd stop existing. Right? Some of these like Greek mythology films and so on and so forth. It doesn't work like that. If God stops believing in us, we don't exist, so to speak. Speaking metaphorically there, God doesn't, if He doesn't sustain us, we don't exist. Not the way around. So He made us as evidence of Himself. That's it. You can't rhyme or reason something pre-existent to God Himself, who is the first cause of everything, because He's not a creature. And so the problem is, we should not anthropomorphize God. I realized that all our misconceptions about God was because we sometimes accidentally anthropomorphize God, thought of Him as a human being, as a creature, what have you. Even those who are the most dedicated on the Tawheed accidentally or sometimes mistakenly, not realizing, obviously mistakes happen, we learn and what have you, but we mistakenly anthropomorphize God. We assume God is like us. Because it's the only way we can. Many humans believe, or many humans act in a way that the only way they can relate to something else that has a character, has a personality, is to think it's like a human being, right? But it's not. When you contemplate it, it's not like us at all whatsoever.
Are there any more questions from the floor?
Sister at the back.
You touched on this idea of it can't be anything but Islam. But what do you think of a more... So I've heard this theory of sort of a more pluralism kind of idea within Islam. The fact that God says that He did create different people, different types of people, so we get to know one another. And I mean, there is evidence of pluralism, even within the Prophet's life himself. But what do you think of this idea that actually, for example, Judaism and the unaltered version of Christianity could actually be God's right version of how the real world should be? What if Islam isn't the right answer?
Okay. Well, generally speaking, so the sister asked the question, which is, how do we know that Islam is right when there are other religions that exist, and two of them obviously are Christianity and Judaism, and there are more than that. There's other religions and other nations and so on and so forth. So how do we know that Islam is right, or how do we know that God didn't intend Islam to be one of many paths to God? They call it perennialism. Well, the thing is this: the truth is only one thing. It's not two truths or three truths. I don't care how postmodern you are. Truth is only going to be one thing. As God is one, the reality He created is only going to be one reality, one truth, and everything that's part of that doesn't contradict itself, and so on. So, with the Christianity and Judaism, the unaltered version of Christianity and the unaltered version of Judaism is saying the same message as Islam, minus a few prophets, of course. So obviously, Judaism doesn't recognize Jesus as the Messiah, and doesn't recognize the Prophet Muhammad, although actually some Jewish rabbis do recognize the Prophet Muhammad was sent, but as a prophet for the Gentiles, not to the Jews. They view it as the fulfillment of the promise that Ishmael's children or progeny will be made into a great nation. So they view it as the prophecy being fulfilled, but only for the Gentiles. Christians obviously don't accept the Prophet Muhammad, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, or at least most of them, we don't accept the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, because it contradicts the Trinitarian concept of Jesus and God, and that's the issue. But here's the problem: if the truth is the truth, it should come from all mankind, all nations, and so on and so forth. Initially, the tribes of Israel, the 12 tribes of Israel, their mission was to spread monotheism to the world and to be witnesses to mankind. As the Old Testament attests, they had mixed results in that matter. As for Christianity, it was obviously Jesus was actually meant to revive the peoples of Judea, the 12 tribes of Israel, meant to come to them, revive them, lead them. But by and large, he was rejected, and as the Messiah, and was not accepted. Added to that, Greeks or some Greek Gentiles, Romans, and so on and so forth took the ideas, and it kind of just changed over time and went somewhere else in a different direction. So Islam views itself as it's more universal than Judaism. Judaism is very specifically for the 12 tribes of Israel. So Islam views itself as for all mankind. And as for Christianity, well, Islam views itself as rectifying the distortions that happened in Christianity, and distortions of the message of Jesus. It comes to actually reaffirm what he said, right? Reaffirm and to reiterate this. So the reason why not Judaism is because it's too provincial in terms of its objective, and not Christianity because it distorted the message. So Islam, in a way, has come to rectify those things and make a universalist message that should be followed and believed by all mankind and not one specific tribe. Now, to be fair, because I want to have to be fair and objective about this, is that in Judaism there is the concept of the Noahide laws, which is that all Gentiles or non-Jews should be at the very minimum under the laws of Noah. The minimum laws of Noah, which I might add Muslims fulfill. We tick all those boxes, including halal meat is also not eating meat that is carrion, meat that still has blood in it. That's also one of the Noahide laws. So as Muslims, we're actually fulfilling the Noahide laws there. But we believe that those laws are very small. Surely non-Jews should have more detail, more sophistication, a full complexity of guidance, not just very small amount of 7 laws, I think it is, only 7 laws. So Islam is a broader, universal message, reiterating the same message, but this time for all mankind, for everyone to follow, and that everyone can adopt, not just 12 tribes of Israel. And of course, Christianity was actually meant only for the tribes of Israel, but it got taken by Romans and Greeks, and the message got distorted, and we have what we have today. So Islam came as rectifying that. So that's why I say it's Islam rather than Judaism and Christianity. Although, if you lived during the time of Jesus, obviously you follow Jesus. If you lived during the time of Moses, you follow Moses.
I think we'll take the last one. I'll take it from the phone. This is a little bit different topic.
Okay.
How could
Sounds ominous.
it's not too bad. How could the rising Islamophobia in the West negatively impact organizational behavior, foreign and domestic trade, and any general business exchange globally?
I think someone's got an essay question and they want me to inadvertently answer it for them. It's like, okay, it's due in tomorrow or whatever. Let me, Abdullah can help me. So how does Islamophobia affect organizational behavior? That's, is it multiple choice or?
10,000 words is what they
Okay.
need. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Preferably written.
if you
Okay, so rising in the West, negative impact foreign and domestic trade and general business exchange globally. So that's a lecture in of itself. All I'll say is Islamophobia and the West. Well, I make 2 points about this, just 2 points, which is the West has had a history of having issues or prejudice against certain minority groups. So people often think that in the 20th century, it was only Germany that had issues with Jews, that were anti-Semitic. It wasn't only Germany. England, France, United States, strong anti-Semitism against Jews. From 1890, it started to become more significant, all the way to 1940s. There was an interesting book I read called The Roots of Hate. I forget now the name of the author. It'll come to me in a second. And he looked at the newspaper articles at the time, and he kind of did a statistical analysis looking at what newspapers were producing the most frequent negative articles about Jews at the time. And he looked at all the newspapers, this is from 1890 to 1940. And he determined that one of the newspaper producing, out of the selection that he was looked at, the selection that they looked at, the newspaper producing the most frequent negative articles against Jews, and he measured the German newspapers and compared to British newspapers and French and what have you, was a British newspaper. Not even the leading German newspaper produced the most frequent amount of negative articles. It was at the time a leading English newspaper, which Daily Mail, which produced more negative articles, articles that he judged to be negative against Jews than the leading German newspaper at the time. Henry Ford, the industrialist, everyone knows Henry Ford, industrialist. He wrote a unfortunately best-selling book called The International Jew, which talked about Jews are trying to take over the West. They have a different law, different religion, different customs. They are attacking Gentile women and what have you, rape and all this stuff. The same arguments you hear today from Islamophobes, you heard argued in America, in England, in France. Again, we don't even need to go discuss Germany. I'm just going to talk about England, France, and United States. Just those countries. Anti-Semitism was rife during the Europe at that time. And prior to that, the previous minority that was discriminated against by mostly Protestant countries was Catholics, with the same arguments. Same arguments. You can't trust Catholics, they want to take over our country, impose their law, the canon law as it's called. They only have loyalty to a pope, they don't have loyalty to the government of the land. And in England it was particularly nasty. They couldn't get positions of government, they had to take an oath, they had to publicly disavow the pope, which is part of their belief to believe in. You're asked to disavow the Pope. So when you look at Islamophobia, I want you to look at it through a historical lens. That this is not the first time it's happened. It's a repetition of something that happens again and again and again in Western post-Enlightenment Europe. The second point is that Islam, more than any other religion or belief, you could argue maybe Judaism, the West has had historical issues with from its very foundations. So, from the beliefs about Christianity, the beliefs on Christianity and New Testament, where obviously Jews are portrayed negatively, was used by many Christians, were used to evoke very anti-Semitic and hateful rhetoric against Jews and perspective towards Jews. When Muslims came to Spain, came to Islamic Iberia at the time, wasn't called Spain. Well, it's Iberia anyway. They actually encountered that the Jews were being persecuted by Christians when the Muslims first came to Spain. That's why Jews helped Muslims again, because Muslims didn't persecute Jews, and they saw with Muslims a kind of liberation that they wouldn't have got under the laws, the very, very discriminatory laws that they were under during medieval Iberia, under Christian Iberia. So from the get-go, this has been in European psyche. And of course, Islam, well, that, you could argue that modern Europe, or even the West, that views itself as the West, is actually in a way the product of Islam, but not in the way you think. Okay, you could say the Renaissance was due to contact with Islamic technology and development and learning. Yes, yeah, that's true. But the West identified itself as one collective whole during the Crusades. The idea, you see the word Christendom arise, where all the countries viewed themselves, all the Latin Christian countries, viewed themselves as one group against others. Again, and they were separate from the Eastern Greek Christians, the Greek-based Christians, right? The Western and Eastern Roman Empire, that goes back to the history, but the Western Roman Empire was very Latin-speaking, the Eastern was more Greek-speaking, but the Christians of the West view themselves now separate. Christendom that didn't include the Eastern Orthodox Christians, didn't include them. They even launched Northern Crusades. They call them the Northern Crusades or the Baltic Crusades. They launched crusades against Orthodox Christians in areas like Latvia and Poland and what have you, all that basic region. Right? They launched crusades against them. So they viewed themselves as separate. And that was, in a way, the Crusades were the time when the Roman Catholic Church could initiate wars and then described its people as one Christendom. Its people. Whereas before they had been different kingdoms. And they were still different kingdoms. But the Pope tried to kind of like re-knit them into a new Roman Empire. Because the Catholics still look back to the good old days of the Roman Empire, because that's where the Catholic Church arose from, the Roman Empire. So you could see them getting these German barbarians who were never under the Roman Empire and like trying to dress them in Roman-looking garbs and put a Roman crown on their head, so to speak, to try to harken back to the good old days. And these German barbarians have just converted to Christianity and just converted to Catholicism, and the church wants to put them, make them what is called the Holy Roman Empire, Charlemagne, and so on and so forth. Anyway, of course, there's another other thing, which is we, in a way, accidentally created the Catholic Church. Muslims accidentally created the Catholic Church. Prior to us, the Bishop of Rome was one bishop in a council of bishops under the Eastern Roman Empire we call the Byzantines. They called themselves Romans. They didn't say we're the Eastern Roman Empire. They said we're Romans because the Western Roman Empire fell, so they were the only Romans around. There was the Bishop of Constantinople, the Bishop of Alexandria, the Bishop of Antioch, the Bishop of Rome, all in the council controlled by the Emperor. Okay, but when Muslims under the caliphates of Abu Bakr and Umar obviously hit the Byzantine or the Roman Empire became weaker. It had to withdraw from Italy. And the Bishop of Rome was finally free from control by the Romans and decided to start preaching to these German barbarians who had taken over Western Europe and go it alone, become independent. So in a way, we accidentally created the modern Catholic Church, and the Crusades was the one that defined Christendom, where all these different kingdoms viewed themselves as one collective civilization, which up then until in 19th century, because the Russians were developing due to their Renaissance. They coined the term the west of Russia and the east, and that's where the term West. And then the term Christendom became Christian Europe, and then it became West. So in a way, Western history is with Islam and Muslims have been tied into their DNA from the get-go. So they have a very personal history with us as well. So you could argue that anti-Semitism and Islamophobia have been tied into, unfortunately, Western European DNA since inception, unfortunately. So there's these two aspects of Islamophobia. How are we going to deal with this? I'm going to leave it at that to you. I'm only just going to tell you the facts. I'll leave it to you to try to work out some solutions. But anyway, Jazakallah for listening. I think that's my point.
That's it. Jazakallah khair.
We will end there, inshallah.